that if only we could control the world a little bit more, if only we could, be a little bit more successful here, and if only we could get people to act in a certain way, or to have a little bit more of this or a little bit less of that, and to just keep trying to hold on to everything and just keep it the way it should be, then you'll be okay, right? And the tough news is that actually we live in this crazy dynamic world that is so complicated, like that the impacts of your actions are impossible to predict. And so to be holding your sense of self and happiness and your readiness to be compassionate hostage to the situation being ready for it, you're going to be holding your breath for a long time. And I don't think it's difficult to shift that if only you were told from the beginning. And it's quite simple when you look at the neuroscience and you just say, hey, like your experience is really just something that is happening in your nervous system.
Welcome to the Flow Sutra podcast, a place where we discuss all things flow and all things self-transcendence. Today we have a very special guest, Lars Sandved Smith, who is a computational neuroscientist and is currently doing his doctoral research on contemplative neuroscience, specifically around meta-awareness. And I am so excited for the research that you're doing. I know we talked about it, a couple of weeks ago, and it was just so fascinating for me to hear about all the things that you're working on. I also feel like, just as a way of introduction, so we both met at KPMG, and we have a similar sort of background in terms of working in that corporate world and that management consulting world, and then burnout striking, and then pivoting into a very different way of life, if you will. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what that journey was like for you.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. First of all, it's really cool to be talking with you again. Yeah, you're right. So we met at KPMG in one of the sessions that I was doing there, and delivering a bit of a meditation talk. And that's kind of this end of this full circle that I guess I've gone through, from working at KPMG, and then consulting. I kind of moved to Deloitte as well, and data management consulting for a little bit, and then discovering a little bit about, I wasn't quite happy. I wasn't quite enjoying it. And then I left and retrained and went deep into meditation and neuroscience. And I kind of coming full circle around now and delivering the talk back at KPMG. But to kind of flesh that out a little bit, I guess it all started even before consulting, because my background originally was in physics and philosophy. And the kinds of questions that really got me excited about doing that were things like, basically came from reading a lot of sci-fi and just enjoying, talking about what really is going on, what do we know about how the universe works and our place within it. And then I sort of started to go down this route, an academic route within physics, and for a bunch of different reasons ended up bailing out of it, mostly because I realized that where I was, particularly I was in particle physics, if I didn't absolutely love it, like more than anything else in my life, there was no way I was going to be able to keep up with everybody around me. So I kind of bailed out, and then ended up in consulting, which I think is how it ends up for a lot of people, is kind of not quite knowing necessarily. I don't know how it was for you, but I wasn't exactly sure at that point what I wanted to do, but consulting kind of ticks all these boxes, right? Like great, like soft skills and people skills and lots of different projects, and you get to learn lots of things and try different industries. And so I ended up on the grad scheme at KPMG, and really enjoyed it. For I think like having left, I can kind of sometimes look back and be like, oh no, it was so whatever. But I learned so much there and met really amazing people, and I was doing mergers and acquisitions or tech consulting, Um, and essentially what happened was that although I wasn't aware of it at all at the time, I was burning out. And I didn't even have that language for it at the time, because I was just, pretty new. I mean, this was like a few years in at this point. I was quite new and just wanted to really prove myself all the time and do my best and just being early in my career. I kind of ignored everything else a little bit. And I think that's pretty common. I think that's kind of what these companies survive off a lot of the time, is sort of like, people wanting to do well right out of university and stuff. So I was really pushing myself pretty hard, and it was just combined with a pretty poor boss at the time. And I think it just takes one person in your team to make your life really difficult, right? Yeah. And this guy had it out for me from the beginning, and I still don't really understand why. But all that together meant that I actually ended up getting really bad migraines for the first time in my life. And that never happened to me before, and I kind of ignored it and ignored it and ignored it. And it got so bad that I couldn't eat and I couldn't keep down painkillers. And then suddenly I found myself in the hospital on a drip because of dehydration. And it was just kind of like this wake up call, like, whoa, how did I get here? And I'm ignoring it, still working and doing my thing. And then all of a sudden I'm like completely out. And so it launched for me this questioning a little bit. And I took some time off, and it also coincided with me then changing company, and I had a bit of a break between there, and it was an unexpected break because of gardening leave. And so I just had these few months on my hand all of a sudden with time to kind of go inward and figure out what had happened there, how to manage it. And so that was about when I started discovering meditation, and I really enjoyed it. I kind of started it off as a bit of an experiment and just said, okay, I'll just try this for however many days, however much a day, and see what happens. And I really didn't understand what was happening at all, and I hated that because I'd come from this like physics background, where pretty much everything is, it's well mapped out. There's kind of very few fuzzy edges. I mean, there are, of course, but the mindset that I had coming from that world was like, well, I think I have a sense that I understand what's going on in the world, like more or less. Like I get like there's the physics that are very small, and then there's like sort of biology somewhere in between, and then the physics is very big, and we sort of fit into that in some way, and that's kind of that. But then with meditation, there was just this kind of series of experiences that I didn't have a box to put them in. And without putting too much importance on what the experience was, or how to interpret it or whatever, what really was powerful for me was that it just pulled this worldview, this like world model that I had out from underneath me. And I just ended up in this kind of like void like space in my mind of like, wow, I really don't know anything actually. Like I had all these beliefs and all these ideas about how things work, and then I'm doing this stuff and I have no idea how to make sense of it. And so that just like sent me on this, at the time, I guess I was seeking pretty hard, and I wouldn't have said that at the time, but all my time was spent reading and listening to podcasts and just getting deep into trying to figure out what meditation is and what it's about. And so because I had this background in science, I started gravitating towards the science of meditation and figuring out, okay, well, this is something I'm doing with my nervous system, I guess. So what exactly do we know about how it's changing the nervous system, or what the nervous system is, or how the nervous system interacts with the environment? And that's what led me to contemplative neuroscience. So first I was just reading it myself and just out of interest, and then eventually got to the point where I realized, okay, I don't want to continue in consulting, and I'm finding this really interesting, and I could tell there was so much value in it. Like me, a year or two before compared to me then, it was just like I could tell that something had changed. And if somebody had asked me to articulate exactly what at the time, it's kind of difficult, but things just seemed better, right? And so took a bit of a leap, and both my girlfriend and I actually left London and we went to India without much of a plan, and studied yoga out there and did yoga teacher trainings and had a really good time, and really just sank into the practice. And then when I got back from that, I was even more sure that that's kind of where I wanted to take things. And I thought with my background in science, I could be most effective in getting into the research. And when I say most effective, like where can I put my energy into to help spread these tools as widely and as effectively as possible? I thought, well, might as well leverage some of what I've got and go back into the science. And that's how I ended up back in research, this time in computational neuroscience. And I was lucky enough to start working with a researcher in meditation research here in France, a guy called Antoine Ruz, who I'd known about through my reading beforehand. And I kind of I emailed him straight away almost. And I was like, hey, I'd really like to come and join you. And it was just good timing, and we got on. So I've been working with him since. And yeah, a few years later, here I am, and now going back to KPMG and sort of bringing what I've learned on that journey into the form of, a few talks and courses that I've been delivering within a different consulting firm since then.
That's
a bit of a long.
I love how you've kind of laid it all out, because I feel like a lot of people have these similar experiences, especially, working in this like high pressure environment and then going through burnout. And, when you were talking about ending up in the hospital, like literally, and having like just one person just having so much anxiety and stress that they don't know how to emotionally self-regulate, that they take it out on their coworkers, and it could just be one person. But I think the way our brains work, like mirror neurons and things like that, we kind of just almost, as strong as our practice can be, sometimes, it's, if someone's directing all that stress and anxiety at you, then that really takes a toll on our nervous system, right? Like,
absolutely.
And even for me, I ended up having an anaphylaxis attack, and I was just like, whoa, how did I end up here?
Wow.
From all of that stress. So, like for me as well, I can see that, we have parallel journeys into pivoting into things that are different, but in a way, it's kind of, there was this starvation of meaning from my end previously that created this void, and then all of a sudden it's just like, okay, there are so many interesting things that I really care about, and I really want to dedicate my life's work to this. And that's so beautiful, and I feel like not everyone has that opportunity to do that, but I feel like having these conversations are important, because a lot of people experience going through that burnout, and then maybe they're still not able to find purpose or meaning from that experience, and find their kind of calling or dharma, if you will, right?
And I think what can be difficult is that, for me, I was fortunate enough to just be in a period of my life where I could take the space, and I could take some time out to sort of figure out where I wanted to go next. And for some people, you're too in it, you got too many responsibilities, maybe there's kids, maybe there's mortgage, maybe there's other things, and it's hard to simultaneously keep all that afloat and sort of remove yourself from it enough to figure out what's next. Because the reason we sort of dropped everything and went out to India, I mean, it could have been anywhere really, but we kept meeting up and saying, so what, if not this, then what? And what are we interested in, and what do we want to build, and where do we want to take things? And we found that we couldn't really have that conversation while still being in that context, because the context is reinforcing that pattern that's already been going. The people around you are reinforcing a certain value system that you feel terrified of stepping out of. So I do think travel is really powerful for that, to get out. For me, it was really at that point in my life to go out and just see other people, obviously living completely beautiful, valid, successful lives in ways that have nothing to do with all the things that, I thought were important up until that point. And it kind of helped me relax and just be like, okay, I don't need to take this too seriously. I can figure out a way here. But there is a lot of privilege wrapped up in that as well. And I think that is worth acknowledging, that very fortunate to be able to have done that.
Yeah, I recognize that as well, because even I now, when I think about it, I also had the privilege to take time out of work to kind of reevaluate and, think about the maps and models that my brain was functioning in. And, when you were talking about having that rug pulled out from under you and being like, oh, wow, now I have so many different perspectives and not just this one where I felt like I was pigeonholing myself into. And it's just like an expansive experience using contemplative practices.
No, definitely. Those experiences can, if anything else, just make you question what you previously knew, right?
Absolutely. And that also brings me to a point in your research where I think you were talking about meta-awareness, the awareness of awareness. So
yeah.
So even from my own practice, so I've been practicing Vipassana-based meditation, which is just open monitoring, kind of divergent kind of meditation, and I feel like there are so many different kinds of meditation and the awareness of awareness that sometimes the language and the experience that you have, like it's just like, what is going on, right? Because then there's like meditations like Dzogchen, the non-duality type meditations where the subject and object collapses, right? And it's just the experience itself. And so what is that awareness of awareness? What is this like witness consciousness in this language? And help us understand.
What a question. I mean, that is the question. I mean, so what motivates me in my work right now, and what sort of brought me into this space, is a little bit of a frustration I was having around these questions as well. As I was first sort of discovering meditation and reading, Tibetan texts and Zen texts and Theravada Buddhism, even into sort of Hindu and Sufi, and you kind of go around all these different traditions, and you can tell that there's a lot of similarity about what's being talked about here. And in fact, you go deep enough in each of these mystical traditions, and it seems like they all arrive ultimately at a very, very similar point, even though the way that it's being spoken about can be so different. It's being informed by the cultural, socio-historical norms and context of the time, the tropes, the imagery that would have spoken to people. And so it sounds so different. And what's lacking at the moment is a very rigorous Western scientific version of that allows us to start to talk about exactly that. Like, what are we talking about in the meditation? What exactly is happening in meditation? How do you distinguish different meditations from each other? Where are they leading? Where might different ones lead? What are they good for? How do we define these things rigorously? I think is important to a degree, and certainly important for us in the West who kind of want that and crave that. And I was coming into it definitely craving that. Now, much less so, as sort of trust and faith in the practice starts to kind of become more important than actually understanding it itself. But nevertheless, I think it's really important for us to be able to have a common language, and a language that is kind of founded in science ultimately, because if we want large numbers of people to be taking these things on board and to be understanding themselves basically, and to be understanding what might work best for them, what kinds of meditations, where they're at, then we need a bit of this sort of mechanistic approach to things, for better or for worse, right? I think maybe in some ways the kind of Eastern model of like, hey, look, this this person who's very well respected, the teacher, the guru, whatever, has said this, I'm going for it, and I'm not asking questions, may actually be more effective in some ways, but that, you know, that is just ripe for all kinds of misuse and difficult situations that, you know, we've seen so many examples of, and that just doesn't work for us in the West. We want to know why. We want to know how. If we're going to spend our time doing it, if it's going to be 20 valuable minutes in the morning that I have in my busy life and my busy schedule, then I better understand like what I'm getting out of it, right? Which you know, is maybe part of the problem, but that's what my work has been motivated by. And of course, this is a huge project, and I'm not alone in this at all. I'm standing on the shoulders of many giants. But there is a big acceleration of contemplative neuroscience over the last 20 years or so, as we've started to be able to look inside the brain for the first time, you know, really ever. If you think just the fMRI was invented in 1991, so recent. And so we're starting to understand how these different practices change the brain, change the nervous system, change different processes going on, and beginning to build a bit of a picture. And I just want to labor on that point a little bit more, because I find it so exciting, because people kind of, when I talk about meditation, often you get this reaction like, yeah, but if it was actually important, or if it was actually useful or beneficial, I would have been told that already. You know, I would already know that. Everybody would know that. And actually, that's not true. You know, we are learning stuff all the time. And we are in this period of human history that is so exciting now, where for the first time ever, we can start looking at objective measures of subjective experience and begin to piece together really novel insights into things that we couldn't do before, except based on report. And so, you know, if we knew everything, no scientists would have a job, right? There would be nothing left to do. The fact that there's a lot of scientists out there working on a lot of stuff means that obviously there's stuff happening. We just fall into this trap of feeling like it's all figured out. And I think it has something to do with, you know, how we're taught science and things at school. But we are definitely in this sort of hockey stick moment in history now, where we're beginning to come to grips with, or start to understand a little bit more about what we are and how we might use that knowledge to improve the state of affairs, basically. So to come all the way around to your question, awareness of awareness, well, that was the question that I was trying to formalize in my work in computational neuroscience. So I work within a small sort of corner of neuroscience that's growing now, but it's within a framework called active inference, which is the sort of brainchild, or you know, the development or discovery, or however you want to say it, of neuroscientist Carl Friston, and of course all of his colleagues as well. And it's a model of what our nervous system is doing, that is basically saying that your perception action model is based on this Bayesian framework of it gives you I never know which angle to come in at this on, but it essentially gives you a framework to understand what is driving perception and action within a biological system, and other systems as well. But within a biological system is where it gets interesting. And that framework is sort of defined computationally or mathematically. And so you can start to define computational models about different cognitive systems. And a lot of work has been done around this, and some really exciting developments on how it applies to all kinds of understanding different pathologies and schizophrenia and ADHD. But I came in from the lens of meditation and trying to understand, well, okay, there's a very promising model here for how the brain and cognition works. Can we use this to start to understand what meditation is, or maybe what the attention of control is, for example, the control of attention is, which is where I started, just trying to develop a model of what it would mean to control attention. And as you know from meditating, one of the first things that you get taught is if you want to control your attention, you should pay attention to where your attention is, right? So there's kind of like this meta level of paying attention. And so then I was just asking the questions like, well, how do we formalize that within this framework? And that's kind of where my work has started and grown from.
So what does your meditation practice look like, and how is your work informing your practice, and how is your practice informing your work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's been this really interesting back and forth between my modeling work and my practice. So just that question that I outlined there which is, how do you start talking about paying attention to attention, was the first sort of example of my practice informing my work. I knew from meditating that is an experience that is had, right? That you can have, that is something that we can do as humans. And I'm not the only one to know that, but I had a particular sort of motivation then to be able to describe that within my work. And so then the model then, I developed some extensions and sort of novel changes to it that allow you to do that kind of thing within it, that gives a cognitive architecture, a computational architecture that could be said to be paying attention to where their attentional states are. So it's like this self-reflective kind of move. But once you've made that move, well, then the model itself starts telling you about other things that you can pay attention to, and other ways in which you can optimize this sort of cognitive architecture. And so if you start asking then questions about like, okay, well, how if this is the architecture that we may or may not have, if that were the case, how best to optimize that architecture? And the question of optimization with an active inference is relatively straightforward. It's just any move that improves your minimization of this quantity, variational free energy, which is it's related to your prediction error. It's like how accurate your model of the world is, or at least that's part of what weighs into it. But so you can ask questions about how best to optimize the model, and those answers that you can get to can end up being meditation instructions. And what was really amazing as this was kind of like developing is I started to see like, oh, so that kind of direction, that type of optimization would be accomplished by a cognitive architecture doing a particular kind of thing, a particular policy. And that policy, if I were to interpret it, so take it out of the computation and into the phenomenology, would be something like, and then it's like a different meditation instruction. And what started to emerge from the model was a lot of things I already knew from teaching meditation and being sort of just aware of different traditions and different types of practice and things. And so I started to get pretty excited that maybe what could emerge from here is a map. Not that we don't already have maps, there's lots of maps that do exist, but this is a map based on, pretty fundamental, information theoretic principles, and it's biologically plausible, and it's also widely used in neuroscience. And that from that, a lot of practices start to emerge. And so I've definitely taken some of the insights from the model into my practice. So let me give you a tangible example. If you can talk about beliefs within active inference, like beliefs that are being held. And so if you cast like the sense of self as a belief, right, that a lot of practices are trying to point you towards no longer holding that belief too strongly, right? So computationally, what does that mean? And what strategies could you employ to do that most effectively? Or what combination of strategies could you employ to do that most effectively? And so the kinds of things that computationally you would have to do to revise a very deeply held belief, so a very strong prior belief, the kinds of policies that you would want to do there end up being pretty powerful meditation instructions. And they end up sounding like pointers, things like, know that you don't know, right? Be confident in the fact that you cannot be confident. And you end up at some of these paradoxical kind of loops a little bit. So what I found interesting was that for example, the 7 factors of enlightenment from sort of Buddhist meditation theory, so things like investigation, so suspended curiosity, concentration, mindfulness, joy, all of those, and without getting into too much detail, kind of drop out of some of this modeling work. So it's been a fun journey, kind of going back and forth between the two.
When you say drop out, for example, all of these different traditions, be it Buddhist traditions, Vedic traditions, Tibetan, they all have specific set of instructions under each tradition, if you will, right? Ways to meditate. So does it actually matter where your awareness or where you're placing your attention? Does that matter, whether it's mindfulness of your breath, whether it's mindfulness of body sensations, whether it's so even if I were to talk about things like compassion, loving kindness meditation, insight meditation, all of these different kinds, like they're all activating different parts of the brain, right? And what excites me so much about the research that, is evolving in contemplative neuroscience is sometimes we can have we have access to all of these traditions and can kind of get lost in it and not know which is the most effective for us per se, right? And what is the most effective way to annihilate your sense of self,
Yeah, well, I think it's not a question that has a general answer, right?
Yeah.
Because what matters most or what is most effective is going to be so dependent on you, and dependent not only on sort of your particular sort of cognitive architecture, to put that way, the kinds of beliefs and priors and experiences and strengths and weaknesses that you're bringing to the game, but also in what you want from the practice. The kinds of meditation instructions that you're going to give somebody who just needs a way to manage acute stress in difficult moments are going to be really different to somebody who comes and says, I want beyond, more than anything else, I'm seeking awakening, enlightenment, or whatever, even if they don't necessarily even know what that is. There's kind of like a completely different motivation there, and this completely different set of what is good for each person. But that's what I think is the potential power here, is that you can have a framework that starts to encompass all of those things, so that you can understand how what starts as a strategy that just helps you manage anxiety or getting out of your head and coming back to a particular object of concentration, to sort of work with that sits within a framework of practices and within sort of an understanding of how these are working on your mind and body, that is also couched within an understanding of the other practices as well. And so that if you were to, if this were to be fleshed out and well understood and well mapped out, that you could start to improve or, be a bit more personalized in how you teach meditation. And it's, if you contrast that to something like going and finding a teacher who has had a lot of success with a particular technique within a particular tradition, you've got a lot of people who, earnest seekers and are really wanting something out of their practice, and will find themselves in a tradition or, with a teacher in a space that they'll practice for years and years and years and years and years, and really not get very far with it because it just doesn't work for them. It's just not what is best for their nervous system. And that is obviously part of the kind of journey, sort of like finding, what works best for you. But I think the potential here is to sort of avoid a lot of those cul-de-sacs and to be able to prescribe, for lack of a better word, even if it's slightly better, but more personalized and direct teachings that are based on their architecture, their strengths and weaknesses, and what they want out of it, but which could follow you along as you develop along the path, right? Or as you develop, or maybe, first you're dealing with stress, and then, okay, you've managed to kind of bring that under control, and then maybe there's some relationships in your life or some other sticking points that you're looking for other practices to help you manage. Great. Well, if we understand, this practice, it strengthens, empathy, relational centers in the brain, then let's move there and let's like start practicing with that. And that most helps you in the moment. And so it keeps meditation sort of fresh, effective, and sort of based on a framework that is, plausible.
And that's really fascinating to me. And it also kind of brings up the question in terms of what is the specific practice that, do you think that, in certain wisdom traditions, we have the set of instructions, it's just general, like everyone follows the same set of instructions, regardless of your own cognitive architecture, right? And for you, do you find that you have to kind of let the path reveal itself, or let the practice reveal itself to you? Or are you finding that, I'm going to try this method to see how I'm doing, if I'm seeing any results with this practice, or do you kind of adapt accordingly?
I think those two things end up being the same thing in a way. So there is a bit of a downside to this way of thinking that is worth sort of flagging from the outset and being sort of just open and vocal about, which is that if you sort of overthink this and over attribute value to a particular framework, particular path, particular map of practices, a map of development, then that can be as limiting as it can be informative as well, where you're just trying to get to the next level, or like, figure out the next thing, or drop the next bit of your ego, whatever that is. And I think that's a bit of a trap with this approach, because it's a really attractive thing. It's part of what, really trapped me or got me or pushed my buttons in consulting. You've got this structure form where you're like, okay, now I'm here, and there's like 2 years of this thing, and I tick these boxes, and then I'm going to be here, I'm going to have this much, and then I'm going to be here, and it's like all laid out for you as this journey. And that's really appealing in some ways. There's a lot of like, you kind of want to be able to do that. In reality, no matter how good these maps and models become, they're not the territory, right? So it's never going to be as clear cut and black and white and understandable or obvious as it originally seems, or that it is presented as. And in that way, I found in my own practice that it is kind of an organic process, and it is something that just takes curiosity and a bit of dedication. And with those two things, the rest sort of come. And if we can just not be too attached to what that looks like, then there's kind of teaching in everything that's going on. And the more that you can kind of lean into that as sort of life as a teacher, and your experience as a teacher, and like every little conversation, every person that you meet is potentially like holding the next key to unlock that little bit of misunderstanding that you're holding in your mind, the smoother things seem to go, and the more you can sort of flow with your life as practice. So I realized in kind of laying that out on a more personal side versus my work, there's kind of like this dichotomy, right, of the approaches. But I do think that with a bit of awareness, a bit of skillfulness, you can weave those two things in together. Use the map as a bit of a framework for exploring, and to kind of hold it lightly, and to be making sure that, you're not overly committing to one idea or another, and being open to other potential avenues, whilst at the same time not being too attached to that, and realizing that, what we're talking about here is a kind of messy biological process that unfolds over, year-long time scales, and that leverages, neuroplasticity, which isn't, like a computer program. It's much more fluid than that. So to kind of have both those sides of it.
Yeah, I feel like, even in the scientific world, true science is really not holding on to your hypothesis as, this is the gold standard. I'm attached to it. This is what I'm trying to prove, and I'm going to, use everything in my power to try and prove this. Like, that's not how science works, right? And
Totally.
and I guess that's not how your contemplative practices work either. Like, I wonder how much it is like, yes, there is a path that's laid out for you, but it's up to you to travel on that path. It's up to you to journey, and perhaps you'll find your own ways of being, an innate wisdom that kind of comes through that process. And it's, I suppose, having that kind of dedication and curiosity, and really just curiosity at the end of the day, of our own minds, like, we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's been interesting is when you have a very sort of well-defined, structured framework based on first principles and biological stuff, and then what comes out of it is a policy that is something to the effect of what I said before, which is know that you don't know, right? And so from this like various or rigorous framework, there's this insight or this intuition that kind of comes out of it, that is the best thing that you can do is actually to be continuously curious, or like continuously don't know mind in every way, everywhere you're going. And I don't know, I just really like that. I really like that this kind of very, traditionally sort of hard-nosed scientific thing is then sort of giving me this hint that the best thing actually is to not take it, to really put your mind in the phenomenological situation where you feel like you are fresh at every moment.
And all of these experiences, I feel, are subjective experiences, right? And what's so exciting about the neuroscience is that we are able to kind of objectively analyze these subjective experiences and see if there is any correlation between what all of these traditions are talking about. So I think, like you said, we're an exponential curve of loads of research being done in this field, but I still feel like there's a lot more to be done. And it would be great to kind of have that language, and instead of like, having this magical language, or this like shrouded in religion and a terminology and obscure language, ancient languages that, most people don't understand. How do we like then disseminate this information to the masses,
That's, I think, the biggest positive impact of this kind of work and this kind of program, is that it gives that language that is palatable to the largest number of people. It also allows you to start having conversations more like governmental bodies. If we really do start to be able to map out, hey, this is what it means for us to have a nervous system. This is what it means to be human, right? This is what we've got going on. And we can really improve the situation. We can really improve our experience if we do these things. And this is why. Here's the mechanistic sort of link between this exact practice and this exact effect. And with that, you can start to, affect serious policy change and educational change. Maybe start bringing these things in earlier in our lives. Why is it that nobody ever asks you how you're feeling at school? You're just kind of going. And I think that bridge that I just touched on there, that's the really important part. That's the important part that is still missing. That bridge between what we're doing, which is the practices themselves, be it yoga, meditation, or even psychology or psychotherapy, And then there's the effects, right? Because the field of contemplative neuroscience at the moment is mostly preoccupied with effects. So you'll put like a group of people, you'll get them to meditate for 8 weeks, and then you'll run tests on them in very different kinds of tests. And you'll say, okay, well, that meditation had some correlation with these effects. And so we know that this meditation leads to this. And there's so much exciting stuff of that sort out there in the field where, okay, this kind of meditation leads to these effects, these kind of meditation leads to these effects. And we're starting to get a pretty good picture about what meditation does. And already that has a lot of people excited. Already, I think you can look at that and be, motivated and convinced to do something about that and be implementing it in any way that you can, or any way that you see is helpful. But it's still lacking that bridge, that causal link between the practice and the effect. We don't know why paying attention to the breath or doing compassion meditation leads to the effects that we see in the research necessarily. And that's where I think the computational stuff really starts to come in, where you can start to have these causal links between the two things. And when you can really do that, when you can really articulate that clearly to anybody, then I think we get into a pretty exciting situation where anybody who listens really will be motivated to, share this with as many people as possible, because we're all in the same game here. We're all just trying to figure out how best to, manage these incredible machines that we're living in, right? These incredible biological miracles. How do we, what's the best to do with them? And there's so much to be gained from these ancient wisdom traditions. And if we just had the language to kind of get that across to as many people as possible, then I'm not saying we take everything, obviously, but just a little bit, just a few tools in the toolkits of kids going through school today means that 2-3 generations down the line, we might be living in a completely different world.
That is so exciting, because it's all about how do we get our neurobiology to work for us instead of against us, when the culture has stacked everything against us to kind of go haywire in our systems, in our nervous system. So how are we able to leverage that? And I think, of course, wisdom traditions have some great insight into how you can manage that, right? Even things such as doing selfless work, like karma yoga, for example, that branch of yoga that focuses on service, coming from service, right? And I think from a neurobiological perspective, it's probably because it takes that kind of ego out of, well, I don't know how much the ego disappears completely, but I feel like doing it in that way kind of takes the ego out, and then that naturally reduces the amount of stress or achievement-based kind of culture that we live in to kick in and override our systems.
Completely.
So, but if we had the neurobiological signature of, oh, this is what it means to operate from compassion, or to operate from joy, or to operate from service, and if we understood what we're striving for, what is enlightenment, is it just having you've seen it described in different wisdom traditions by different masters of meditation, but I have never experienced that apart from certain moments of slipping into that void during meditation retreats. I don't think I've experienced that moment of whatever they're describing, right? What that is. And it's fascinating to have that. And I don't know, maybe one day we'll even, I think we're already having certain kind of neurofeedback technologies that are helping people meditate better, to understand their own kind of, okay, now I'm in beta wave. Okay, now I've achieved alpha. Now I've achieved delta. And, I think, do you have much insight into kind of that world of technology and
of the neurofeedback world? Well, just on your point just before, you said something there about, what is it like to live from a place of compassion, a place of joy, and how do we make sense of what these meditation masters and traditions are telling us throughout all time? I think that you can go deep on sort of teasing all that stuff out, but really what seems universal across the board, across, traditions, religions for all time, is this move towards a more encompassing sphere of empathy and identification, right? Moving away from being completely absorbed in your own little story to starting to notice the people around you, to starting to act from a place that takes them into consideration. And I think it's part of what is so, powerful about like starting a family or being in a really strong community, or like why we value those things so much, is because that's the kind of experience that brings you out of your head a little bit and like, whoa, okay, so now my life is more in service. And that sounds so anathema to what we think we want, which is like, no, I want everything to be in service to me, right? But then in reality, when you speak to people about it, people on their deathbed and they look back in their life, what was the most valuable, the best part of their life? Well, it was the times when they were helping others. It was the times when they were raising their kids. It was the times when they were, of service to their community. And so to kind of start to understand how best to get there and why that is actually ends up being the best thing for you as well, in a way, is really important, especially as we're moving into this time now where, 2020 has shown us there are serious global issues, and there's just more coming our way with the climate crisis that does require a shift in identity. It does require a shift in mindset. We can't be thinking on, individual, family, community, even national levels anymore. We need to be thinking on a global scale. And the thing is, that's not easy, right? It's actually pretty hard to do. It's really hard to do because we have this evolutionary programming of this in-group, out-group, tribal kind of programming that we've picked up from our evolutionary past that stops us from being able to do that. And so how do we use some of these practices? How do we use some of the insights from contemplative neuroscience, for instance, to help that transition, to accelerate that transition to a more global, compassionate worldview? And it's funny because as I say that, global, compassionate worldview, it's kind of like, ugh, right? And I can imagine somebody listening to this being like, yeah, whatever, you hippie, right? Like it's kind of like sticky and can sound a bit gross, but actually what we're talking about here is really terrifying. And like, it can be it's like really, that's an edge, and it takes a lot of guts and a bit of bravery, and like to really push into, maybe you're not the most important story going on. And there's a big part of you that you need to let go of and let die, for you to be able to grow into that realization and to start taking more wider problems more seriously. And that is not some airy-fairy, easy thing to do, right? How do you be the best ancestor?
Gosh, I just love everything that you've just said, because it's so powerful in a way as to why this work is so important, because it's through empathy and compassion that we are going to make a shift in this world. And the question that's always been in my mind as well has been like, how do we make compassion go viral as as soft and as much as people don't want to hear it? I think that is the key, even within organizations and corporations. Like, why is it so difficult for us to afford compassion to the people that we work with, when innately we have that helpless high, we know it feels good to help other people. But why is it that, so much of the world is stuck in their own stories and in their own agendas, and there's so much scarcity mindset, and there's all these global challenges. And, I think for me, like, it's always been, yes, I think compassion and the ability to kind of see things from different perspectives greatly matters. But also, ultimately, I feel like it's all to do with kind of shining the light of consciousness on yourself to be like, okay, where can I see the reflections of things that are not right within me, things that I'm striving towards, certain virtues or certain, my moral compass is directed towards a certain path. And then, how do I how do I keep going down this path? And it's a constant state of reflection and again,
That's
meta
it. I think
awareness.
that's the key point there, and like everything you've said. Like, how do you get out of the scarcity mindset? How do you move towards empathy and a place of compassion? Is, you know, getting out of this thing that we are all sort of taught growing up, that the solution to our problems lie outside of us. That if only we could control the world a little bit more, you know, if only we could, you know, be a little bit more successful here, and if only we could get people to act in a certain way, or to have a little bit more of this or a little bit less of that, and to just keep trying to hold on to everything and just keep it the way it should be, then you'll be okay, right? And the tough news is that actually we live in this crazy dynamic world that is so complicated, like that the impacts of your actions are impossible to predict. And so to be holding your, you know, sense of self and happiness and your readiness to be compassionate hostage to the situation being ready for it, you're going to be holding your breath for a long time. And I don't think it's difficult to shift that if only you were told from the beginning. And it's quite simple when you look at the neuroscience and you just say, hey, like your experience is really just something that is happening in your nervous system. And a big part of that, of course, is what's coming in towards your nervous system, what's being, you know, what's coming in from the environment and bombarding your nervous system, right? Sure, but like you can't really control the stuff that's going on out there, or only minimally anyway, and only sometimes. But what you definitely can control, and what we can now show and prove, is the nervous system itself. So if the nervous system is the basis for your experience and what you ultimately want is a particular experience, well then start there. Start with what you can control, change on the inside. And what's weird and what's kind of amazing then afterwards, right, is that things start changing on the outside naturally, right?
So true.
And that's just something that has to be almost experienced, right, to kind of believe that. Because like, I remember the first time I went on a retreat, I got this challenge. I was like, well, isn't it kind of selfish what you're doing? You're just sitting down for 10 days by yourself for your own happiness. Like, shouldn't you be out there in the world, like bringing things out? And that kind of really threw me a loop a little bit, because like, oh, well, maybe this is really selfish, but I really don't believe that's true. I don't think you can really, like your effectiveness in the world, and like your ability to serve others is so benefited from your own understanding of yourself and how your own mind works.
Yeah, I completely agree. I do not think that it's selfish at all, because yeah, of course you get the benefits of it. But I think it was, you know, I think again, you can flip it and say, like the Dalai Lama was saying, the first person to benefit from compassion is the one who feels it. And, you know, yeah, you are being compassionate to yourself and others, but ultimately, like you are the first person to benefit from feeling these feelings.
Yeah. But actually, it's funny because when you teach meditation, that's the part people often find the hardest.
Right.
Is actually letting themselves feel happy, like giving yourself permission to be happy, giving yourself permission to love yourself. And whilst, and there's kind of like this paradox almost, I see so many people in where you're meditating, you're practicing, and you're doing all these things in life to, you know, be happy in some way, right? But then at the same time, you're holding this deep core belief that you don't deserve it, you're not good enough for it, I'm not allowed to be happy, or whatever your story is that's keeping you away from it. And to just kind of say, hey, there's not a finite amount of compassion here. There isn't a finite amount of joy. There isn't a finite amount of well-being that we have to dish out in the same way that we dish out sort of natural resources. You know, this is something that we can all have in abundance.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely feel like compassion is something that needs to go viral on some level. I just can't wait until this research becomes accessible to the public in such a way that governments actually start paying attention to this and understand that, it is the scary world that we live in. And to some extent, a lot of us become desensitized because there's too much, right? There's too much for our nervous systems to take, and a lot of pain and suffering that we see in the world, that it's almost easier to shut it all out or let it all in, and then have that desensitize you. And I think, that's scary because it's moving towards a more kind of tribalist, nationalist kind of, almost fascism in some respects as well. Like in India, like that's exactly what's happening. So it is scary, and it's also surprising in a way, because you have like this country that, like India, for example, that talks about these spiritual practices and meditation and compassion and yoga and all of this, but it doesn't translate into the governmental structure, or the government talks about it in such a way but doesn't actually practice the tenets of yoga, or and it's just like, okay, so maybe this research, that is in contemplative neuroscience, will really help governments understand the best ways to kind of work together. And because it's, it seems almost straightforward to me that, if you have an abundance mindset, the more people that are educated, the more people that want to contribute to our planet, if you collaborate and come together, then there's obviously going to be an exponential increase in our technology, in our ways of working together, in our ways of supporting each other. And it's just, I feel like it's a good time as well.
Yeah, well, baby steps, but also like we better hurry up a little bit too.
Yeah.
Things are getting kind of serious, and if we can't start, working together and thinking on this level soon, then it's the planet's not going to wait forever for us to wake up. But I do think that with the science, there is a way forward, at least for talking about this. And also, I think just more specifically, just looking at like systems theory, because what you were saying there is how can governments work together? How can we tackle these problems? What we're talking about is really complex systems, self-organizing and optimizing in ways that just work better. And I think one of the interesting things to come out of a lot of sort of game theory and systems theory is that actually altruistic behavior, empathetic kinds of behavior end up being what's best, not only for the individual, but for the entire system that they sit within. And okay, we know this on some level, right? What goes around comes around, or whatever, however you want to call it. But if you can really prove it and say, hey, it's actually better economically and from a sort of mental health and societal level and all these different ways to be acting from a place of compassion, like let's institutionalize empathy and compassion.
Yes. And it's such a reflection of nature as well. Like you see how nature thrives. It's based on abundance. It's based on sharing resources. It's based on one tree actually communicating with another tree and be like, hey, do you have enough nitrogen? Do you need some? Like through the mycelium networks. And it's just like, that's what, like that level of symbiotic relationships, if that's embedded into our cultures and our ways of working and our ways of being, then I think that could be a massive shift in how we live and how we approach the world and ourselves and other people. And as much as it's kind of like hippie thinking, it's true, on some level. It's how do we bring compassion to the table. Okay, so I know that, we've been talking for a while and I feel like I could talk to you about this forever, but I just want to respect your time as well. I guess the last question that I'd love to ask you is, if you had a genie and, you had this like research question that you really wanted an answer to, like what would that be? And you could ask and you would get the answer.
If I had a genie that could answer any research question, I think what would be really helpful for us right now would just be to be clearer on what we are, to understand ourselves more. And in some ways, every field of science is kind of contributing to that. And so that's why it's difficult to pin it down to one exact question that you could ask the genie. But so much of our struggle just comes from this lack of self-awareness, basically, that we don't, quite know how we fit in to our environment. We don't quite understand how we fit into the wider game. We don't really quite know what the wider game is, if there is one. And there's just this lack of meaning and feeling sort of comfortable in ourselves that drives so much of this like anxious, like vibrational kind of mindset in this sort of human psyche. And so if we could just come to a better understanding of what we are, who we are, and how we fit in, and how we can best, taking that, how best to act. How do we best come into harmony with everything that's going on? What are the things that we should be doing if we knew more about what was going on? That's the question I'd like to answer. I suspect that the answer is probably one that's been given to us thousands and thousands of times before, which is compassion. But I think, that'd be a good place to start.
Yeah, I would love to explore that more as well in terms of actually having the answer to that. But you're right, we probably already have the answer, and it's just about us putting that into practice. It's been
funny, these teachings. Sorry, just last point with these teachings, I find that the more I practice with them, the more it feels like a lot of these old platitudes, these things that we just take as exhausted sayings, are just literally true, right? And to not take it further than that, and not to overthink it, and to just almost take it at a very mundane, simple, straightforward way, and not to overthink it and look for too much mystical and transcendence and outside of our minds and escaping from life or whatever, and just bring it back down to earth and just simply do the things that we know we should be doing in the ways that we've been told for millennia.
I mean, exactly. I feel like the simplest answer is often the right answer. Yeah. It's been an amazing conversation. Like, I feel like, again, like a micro flow state, just talking about all these things with you. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear more about your journey and your research. And thank you so much for coming on to the podcast.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun talking to you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. And I'd love to hear about how your research progresses, and I'd love to talk to you about it once you've got more insights into how you want to frame your questions and how you want to go down that rabbit hole.
Absolutely. I'd love to. Let's do this again.
You can find Lars's work with organizations at neuronsofpotential.com, and you can also connect with him on LinkedIn at Lars Sandved Smith. Thank you so much for listening. It's an absolute pleasure to have you back, and I am wishing you an amazing 2021. If you have any questions or any feedback, please get in touch at razor@razorsally.com. Don't be shy. Otherwise, I'm wishing you a beautiful week. Until next time, peace out.